So here we have the continuum, and the actions that are more towards the left, the more disruptive, hard-hitting actions, we tend to call this activism. The actions that are starting towards the middle and might reach over to the harmonious cooperative side, we call them advocacy. So the actions which are not too disruptive, but are bringing attention to the issue and are raising awareness, bringing the voices of the people affected to the public attention, to media attention. We call this advocacy. And on the right, the more harmonious, cooperative actions, we're going to call this lobby. And in a few minutes, we're going to give you a few examples of this so that you can easily start to decide what is going to be effective in your scenario. So example one. Here is an example from the country where I'm currently residing, Sri Lanka. Many of you would have seen on the news last year in 2022, there was, quite an extreme economic crisis in Sri Lanka. So the country ran out of foreign currency. It didn't have US dollars or euros. So it was very difficult to import food, wheat, rice, different proteins, animal food, to pay for things like fuel, also petrol and diesel. So many people in the country didn't have fuel to run the vehicles, cooking fuel. There was no electricity at times. So life became very, very hard for people, and the value of the currency just dropped. Okay, so the value of the money became much less, and it became very difficult for the majority of the population to survive. What happened is that various people, so people, in fact, of all different religions and ethnicities, and people led by civil society organizations and activists, and even members of the general public, they gathered in a very prominent place in the capital city of Sri Lanka. They came right in front of the president's palace, which is on the main road in Sri Lanka, leading right into the heart of the business district and the tourism district, right in front of the big Shangri-La and in front of the public park, which is, very symbolic place. So thousands and thousands of people gathered there, and they refused to move. They set up tents. They started cooking food. They had libraries. They had seminars. So they occupied this space and they refused to move. And there they conducted activities like, small demonstrations, speeches. They did like street dramas, and eventually they stormed the president's palace. Yeah, and the president fled from the country. So my question for you is, what is this an example of? Do you think that this is an example of more activism type actions, advocacy, or lobbying? You can write in the chat. Yeah. Yes, yeah, great. I see most people saying here activism. Yeah. So indeed, this is much more representative of activism. So what is activism? Activism are any actions which are difficult for us to ignore or avoid. for members of the public, for media, and for politicians. So it's difficult to ignore, maybe physically, because physically it occupies a road or a public space, or even in terms of media attention. It's something that you can't not respond to. A politician can't not make a statement in response to it. So it could be, for example, publishing a piece of information online, an opinion or a social media campaign, that the certain politicians or companies just have to respond to, public relations wise. It could be, a form of economic activism, like boycotting certain businesses, or employees, withholding their labor and going on strike and refusing to work until conditions or their pay is changed. It could be, occupation, like what we saw in Sri Lanka, or I think several years ago, Occupy Wall Street is another famous example. Or even now you see, for example, climate activists in Europe will, glue themselves to a podium where a politician is going to make a speech, or glue themselves, to the main podium in the parliament, occupying a space and refusing to leave. Maybe climbing a tree so that the tree can't be chopped down. So street marches, any activities in the public sphere that disrupt traffic, disrupt normal business, that have a very strong public relations component. Even hacking and releasing data, that politicians need to respond. In some country contexts, this may be more or less illegal. In some countries, the authorities don't like to see these kinds of activities, and so they try not to allow things like protests. In other countries, this form of demonstration, these kinds of actions are freely allowed.
7 years ago, I stood on this platform, hoping that the voice of a teenage girl who took a bullet in standing up for her education would be heard. On that day, countries, corporates, civil society, all of us committed to work together to see every child in school by 2030. Yet halfway to that target date, we are facing an education emergency. Let's remind you once again.
Anyway, so this is Malala, who has, since she was herself targeted and couldn't continue going to school, I think most of you will know about her story. So she has become a real advocate for children's education. She is addressing various audiences regularly about the plight of especially girls to be able to go to school. So this was addressing the UN General Assembly in 2022, but she is doing this ever since herself. She was targeted and was supported to become a voice of all those children, especially girls, who are not able to go to school. And she is reminding audiences around the world that even though in 2030 all children should be going to school in the sense of that's the Sustainable Development Goal for education, that this is not the case, and that today children in Afghanistan, Uganda, Pakistan, Ethiopia, Ukraine, for various reasons, cannot go to school. Her fund keeps the issue on the agenda, keeps addressing different audiences, and also doing research, publishing research results in that plight for girls' education. So advocacy is any intervention, any activity by an individual or an organization or alliance or any formal or informal group aiming to influence decision-making towards changes in policies, sometimes changes in the practice or the implementation of policies, or, for example, advocating for budget to be allocated. Again, as Zoe said before, a dead letter is not going to change much. It needs to be put into practice, and resources have to be committed to it. So advocacy is aiming at that in many ways, and it's often used for actions. The term advocacy is used for actions that are aimed at raising awareness and creating attention, putting issues on the agenda with the general public, with politicians, with implementers. So it's a broad term. It also includes demonstrations and campaigning. Actually, it's often used also in the communication sector as almost synonymous for campaigning. But it also includes more inside activities, which we would call lobby. So it's overarching those type of interventions. Examples of it, for example, in the Netherlands, are here. You can see a photo of a group of young farmers from the province of Drenthe offering their agricultural plan to the Minister of Nitrogen in the Netherlands. We have a big nitrogen problem. That is too much of it. And each province is supposed to bring the deposition of nitrogen in the area, in nature, down. And this is where they present their plan to the minister, trying to convince her, advocating for their way of solving that problem and still practicing agriculture. On the right is a picture of the director and other supporters of Milieudefensie, which is the Dutch Friends of the Earth, when they have won a court case against Shell in the case of the pollution of areas in the Niger Delta in Nigeria. You can see in the background Nigerian citizens who, on whose behalf Milieudefensie has done this court case and won it. That is also a form of advocacy, of influencing policy. Maybe this is something that occurs at the very extreme end of when other tactics that you have applied haven't yielded results. So then you go to court to still claim your rights as even as citizens of other countries.
I have been a lobbyist most of my working life. I've worked for several organizations like Greenpeace and Oxfam, and now I have become a trainer. But sometimes I still get involved in lobby. And that was actually last week when I was in the United Nations building in Geneva for a human rights procedure, which was called the Universal Periodic Review. And in this procedure, member states from the United Nations give each other recommendations on the fulfillment of human rights. And then they have 4 years to implement those recommendations. Now, before the sessions where the states talk to each other, that's in November, there were so-called pre-sessions with NGOs that could present reports and comments and their recommendations for the states. And the NGOs aim to influence states to give recommendations to other states. That's the plan. Now, on the right side, you can see me in front of the UN building, in front with my Bangladeshi colleague. She delivered a speech to the representatives of the states on the right to clean water and sanitation in Bangladesh. And we had brought the full report her speech was based on, and a set of summaries with a focus on our recommendations so that member states could pick that up easily. During the meeting, we approached several representatives of states of whom we knew they find water and sanitation really important. And how did we know that? Well, there was another colleague who had done research on the list of all member states to see which country is interested in water and sanitation. So we just had to approach those representatives and talk to them about maybe putting forward a recommendation to Bangladesh on the right to water and sanitation. And actually, 2 states we approached actually promised they might make a recommendation, because you only see it when it's done. And 6 others just took our information to the mission, but could not give any pledge then and there. So we will have to follow up. This is an example of lobby, because we already had an example of advocacy and activism. And the definition of lobby is aiming to influence decision makers and or legislation directly to support your interest or position. And the way you do lobby is very polite, it's very friendly, it's consensus driven. That means you are seldomly confrontational, but you're mostly cooperative. And mostly you do lobby through dialogue or sometimes negotiation. Now, and there are different parties, because of course it's not only us who are approaching these member states with our proposals and recommendations. There are also people from other NGOs that want other interests to be recommended. So it's a game where different parties are trying to talk to each other and trying to influence each other.
Yes. So as Sabina mentioned, there could be a lot of overlap between the different activities. We use the policy influencing continuum to help us understand or help us to analyze whether our actions are disruptive, confrontational, or whether they are cooperative, harmonious. Yeah. So the point is, it doesn't matter too much whether your action is, correctly classified as advocacy or lobbying, what the category is. The point is that this tool can be very useful for you in shifting the status quo. Do we want to be more disruptive, or do we want to be more cooperative? As an organization, or even as an individual who is trying to bring change, quite often we do the same kind of actions again and again and again, and because we are good at doing certain kind of actions. But as I mentioned before, it can be very difficult to actually change policies. And I think some of you will have had this experience, maybe a decade or more trying to change a law. So what we can do is, if we have always been doing, for example, boycotts and strikes, and maybe we have already brought a lot of awareness on this issue, what would happen if we started to be more cooperative with our interlocutors, with the people we're targeting? What would happen if we started to ask them to be, part of a panel discussion on the issue? That would make them respond in a way that directly addresses your issue in a positive way. Or maybe we have been trying to approach our member of parliament about an environmental legislation, and they're just not giving us any attention. They're not agreeing to meet us. They're not listening to us. They're not accepting our recommendations or our position papers. So what we can do is we can start to be more disruptive. We can publish something in the media, or we can do a small demonstration in front of their office that would make them respond. It would put them in a position that they're forced to respond. So the point is not about exactly how you define and classify different actions. The point is that as an organization or as an individual, you can use this understanding to decide if you want to become more disruptive or more cooperative in order to force your decision makers to take some action or to respond or to engage with you. And that way we can change the status quo.